My father was born in Scotland before making the journey across the great waters to America, where he grew up wild and free in the mountains of North Carolina. As a young man, he fought valiantly in the Revolution for America's independence. 10 years after the war, tragedy struck when his first wife took sick with a fever, and then she died and left him with 5 young'uns to raise on his own. But back then, folks had little time for grief, so no sooner than Paul buried his wife, he loaded his mules and led his children across the summit of the mighty Appalachian Mountains to the unknown wilds of Kentucky, where he married again, and on a cold, snowy night on Christmas Eve, 1809, I was born into this world. Eventually, Ma would give birth to 10 children, and so in all there were 15 of us young'uns living in that small Kentucky cabin. Pa had always been one who stayed on the move. He was restless because just 2 years after my birth, he decided to move the family again in search of adventure and a better life. And thus we set out on a 200-mile journey that took us 3 weeks down the Ohio River on a flatboat that was packed with all our earthly belongings before we arrived on the banks of the mighty Mississippi River. Now, in 1811, no white man in their right mind would dare to cross that river into the heart of the native kingdom, yet that's exactly what we did. And then we headed north for 200 more grueling miles by mule, tagging another month before finally settling in a place called Boone's Lick, Missouri. There were several families in our group that were led by men who were just as brave as my father, and they had all made the long journey. And because of the constant threat of attack, we all lived in log cabins surrounded by fort walls. The first year was brutal. There wasn't enough food, and several people didn't make it through the winter. We were unwelcome strangers in a foreign land, and any time we ventured outside of the fort to work the crops in the fields, we always had to take a small army of men to stand guard as lookouts against native attacks, and they occurred frequently. But for a few years, we managed to somehow survive, until one day when I was 8 years old. Now, I remember that day well. Paul was clearing a patch of land, and a tree that he was chopping down broke the wrong way and fell towards him, and tragically, he was crushed beneath the tree and killed instantly. So there we were, all 15 of us, with Ma living in no man's land. There was no way a woman could feed that many mouths on her own. But somehow she and the oldest of her boys did for 4 years before she finally remarried a man who had also lost his wife, and he had several children of his own. And by this time, many of my brothers and sisters were of age, and they had set out on their own, and that left me at 12 years old to somehow adjust to having a stepfather. And yet, I would never even have the chance, because one of the first things he did when he married my mama was to convince her to hire me out to a local craftsman who made leather saddles. An apprenticeship, he told her. It was where her son could learn a trade that would help the family. However, no sooner than I met my new employer did I realize that my stepfather had actually sold me for 2 bags of cornmeal, and I was now the saddle maker's property, with the same rights as his work mules. And I quickly realized that I'd be keeping the same sleeping quarters as those mules. As much of a warrior as my father had been during his life, those around me, well, they looked down on me, literally. I was quite small for my age, bow-legged and barely stood 5 feet tall in my boots, red-haired and freckled. But I always believed one thing that folks couldn't measure was my courage, and deep down I knew the day would come someday where I would prove it to the world. But for now, I worked in Franklin, Missouri, which was located on the eastern end of the famous Santa Fe Trail. Now, this was long before the railroad would ever link the Wild West to eastern America, and the Santa Fe Trail was the main route that wagons took. Oh, but it was a dangerous journey that traveled all the way through Comanche lands in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Colorado before finally arriving in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Most of the folks who bought saddles from our shop were people who were setting out or returning from this journey, and they told of the incredible perils and riches that could be had out west. Night after night I listened to their stories, tales of battles with Comanche warriors, fortunes that were made from beaver pelts, and the wild freedom of the far west. Those stories stirred something inside me. It was just in my blood, and soon they woke up a longing that refused to be quieted. So one night at just 14 years old, after 2 years of stitching leather and listening to the dreams of other men, I made up my mind. I was about to change my destiny. So one night I convinced a group of men who were spending the evening at our shop to take me west with them when the sun rose the next morning. And just like that, my childhood was over, and I ran away to embark on a journey that would soon make me one of the most legendary men in American history. Give someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling. 5 books for the young and old alike that will make your heart smile. Click the link below to order your copy of The Appalachian Storyteller today by 1826. Well, my friends, I was just a teen when I ran away from my employer. Oh, he was furious, and he promptly took out an ad in the local newspaper offering a 1-cent reward to anyone who could capture me and return him to me. But it was too late. My great journey had already begun, and it didn't take long to learn that only the strongest of men could ever survive. One night, as we were traveling across the Great Plains, a pack of wolves surrounded our campsite. One feller reached into the wagon to retrieve his rifle to shoot a wolf when the gun accidentally discharged and blew a gaping hole through his arm. He nearly bled to death in the moment, but somehow he survived through the night, and by sunrise it was obvious that his arm needed to be amputated. So without the aid of any doctor, we gave him a big drink of whiskey, placed a wooden spoon in his mouth, and me and another man held him down, as a third carried out the gruesome task of cutting through the flesh with a razor and then sawing his bone in two with an old saw. Then we used a king bolt from one of the wagons, which we heated until it was glowing red in the campfire, and then pressed it into his flesh as he begged us to just shoot him and put him out of his misery. But it worked. We burned all of his severed arteries in his shoulder to stop the bleeding before packing the entire wound full of tar from a wagon wheel. Believe it or not, somehow this man actually survived and was even able to take care of himself by the time we reached New Mexico. Each day was a constant struggle to find food, and one night, just before sunset, I set out to see if I could find a meal to cook. I had gone about a mile when I saw some elk on the side of a ridge, so I slowly raised my rifle and fired. But just then I heard something from behind me, so I turned around to see 2 angry grizzly bears charging towards me. My gun was empty, and there was no way I could possibly reload it, so I dropped my weapon and took off in a frantic run towards the nearest tree. Within an instant I was 15 feet up that tree, with both bears clawing just beneath me. The standoff lasted for hours as the beasts clawed up the entire earth and tore nearly all of the bark off that tree trying to reach me before they finally gave up and left. For a while I lived with an old mountaineer who agreed to take me in, but I had a hard time finding work, so I went back on the trail with a man who agreed to pay me $1 a day to drive his team of animals. And over the next couple years, I went back and forth on the trail, working as a cook and eventually as a guide, where I met many people, Mexicans, Indians, cowboys, outlaws, and con men, you name it. Now, I was a boy who had never had much schooling, and the truth is I never learned to read or write on paper, but I was always pretty good at reading a stranger, and soon I had learned to speak Spanish and several dialects of the natives, as well as learning sign language. Now this was a valuable skill in this untamed world, and soon I was working as a guide and an interpreter. It wasn't long until I realized that the real money wasn't trapping, and for the next decade I lived as a mountain man and a nomad, traveling through the snowy Rocky Mountains, Yellowstone, Oregon, and even down south in the blistering hot deserts, and as far west as California, where we trapped animals to sell their furs. Now, only a dead man would dare to travel alone in Indian territory in those days, so I always rode with a large group of men who were just as brave as I was, and we hunted as a team, and many times our camps were attacked by native warriors, and bloodshed, well, it became almost a daily occurrence. Now, don't get me wrong, not all natives were against us. Many of them hunted with us, broke bread with us, and we openly traded with the Navajo and their Arapaho Indians. It was around this time that we were camping on the Upper Green River in Oregon with the Arapaho Indians for the winter. It was here that I met a beautiful young woman whose name meant singing grass, and like every man who had ever laid eyes on her, I fell in love with her. The only problem was, so had a Frenchman that was traveling in our group. He was a big fella, a hothead and a drunk, and one day he got word that I had visited Singing Grass the night before, and he flew into a rage and vowed to kill me. He ran towards his horse to retrieve his rifle, and at the same time I